So hello and welcome everyone to our Austin Energy Green Building Seminar, Labor and Materials Transparency. This is our roughly bi-monthly seminar series highlighting topics important to sustainability in the built environment. My name is Mark Ledger and I work with our commercial team here at Austin Energy Green Building, but we have many other people who were involved in putting together this seminar, including Lee Dorr and Julie Chandran from our residential team. Now, before we dive into the presentation, we'll start with a few announcements of local events and put the links directly in the chat below. So the first event is there are a couple of industry events coming soon. The Energy Thought Summit is April 15th through 18th. This year's theme is Imagine. Immerse yourself in the collective wisdom of industry pioneers, thought leaders, and visionaries, inspiring you to push the boundaries of what is possible and shape a future powered by clean, accessible energy resources. Check out their website for details and registration info. The Humid Climate Conference is May 6th and 7th. Learn about the energy transition, the refrigerant transition, the embodied carbon transition, and important transitions underway in high performance enclosure design, MEP engineering, and the policy landscape. Go to their website for more information. AEGB also has an event coming up. Our annual Green by Design series is April 2nd, 9th, and 16th. If you're interested in buying, building, or remodeling a sustainable home, or just want to learn more, these free online workshops cover the whole process, starting with the planning and design phase. You'll learn about building practices and technologies that can help make homes more efficient, more comfortable, and easier to maintain. AEGB e-learning courses are now live. We've added several new on-demand courses so you can earn continuing education credits at your convenience. We will continue to upload recorded webinars and offer additional resources here in the future. Log in to register and see what's new. And next, we are hiring. We have a position available for Energy Efficiency Services Manager to lead our residential team. And our commercial team has a project manager position that will provide consulting and rating services. The application deadline for both is coming up, so apply soon. Go to the City of Austin Jobs website for more information and to apply. And now we'll start with the main program. This seminar has been submitted for AIA Learning Units and GBCI CE hours for lead professionals. Austin Energy Green Building will provide certificates of completion for self-reporting and report AIA hours for all those that attend the entire webinar. All certificates will be emailed. A follow-up email will be sent in a few days with links to the recorded webinar and other resources. And up next, we've got our AIA quality assurance slide. And these are the learning objectives for our seminar today. So today we'll be discussing labor and materials transparency. And I feel like the ideas around transparency and intention have been used in many areas of our lives, but this seminar highlights how those ideas can be applied to the built environment. So as those involved in sustainable buildings, it's important to have a holistic look at buildings and having knowledge about where materials come from and the conditions under which they were produced and the ingredients used to create these products is critical to being intentional about the impacts that we make with buildings. Since these topics are supported by AEGB, with the AEGB ratings, we've created a PDF with rating measures for both commercial and residential that are applicable to our topic. We're posting the link for that in the chat here, and we'll also include it in our follow-up email as well. And up next, if you have any questions during our speakers' presentations, be sure to use the Q&A window throughout the seminar. We've scheduled some time at the end of the seminar to discuss them, but for any of those that we don't get to, we'll get those answered after the presentation and sent with our follow-up. So with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker today. Our first speaker today is John Russell Beaumont. Russell is an associate at COOKFOX. In addition to design, he is involved with studio efforts related to equitable design and participates in research, working groups in the Design for Freedom movement led by Grace Farms, and is a member of the Health Product Declaration Collaborative Social Equity Technical Subgroup. Prior to COOKFOX, he worked at a firm specializing in high-performance affordable housing and studied in the UK as a British Marshall Scholar. Thanks so much for joining us, Russell, and I'll let you take it away.
Thanks for the introduction, Mark, and excited to give a presentation focused on labor certifications for the built environment. And specifically, I'm going to be talking about this through the lens of an architecture firm like myself and tools that we can use to start looking at lowering the risk of forced labor in our projects. You can go to the next slide. And there's the COOKFOX Architects is the firm I'm at. It's a New York-based practice with a focus on integrated, environmentally responsive, and socially equitable design. And so part of what we're going to be talking about today is our efforts to advance the reducing of risk of forced labor in building projects through some of our work in Design for Freedom, as well as some of our research that we've put out in a white paper. You can go to the next slide. So what I'm going to talk about is an overview of what forced labor is so that we're all thinking of the same term, the same concept. I'm going to go over labor certifications that are available to us now in order to start thinking about material selection and how we reduce that risk. 3 is going to be looking at broader tools for project teams and designers to sort of sift through all of these labor certifications and what they mean. And then 4 will just be a conclusion with broad next steps that we see our industry taking to make more advances in this movement. If you go to the next slide, on screen is the definition of forced labor according to the International Labor Organization, Forced Labor Convention. So when we initially approached this topic, we thought of the most egregious forms of forced labor, which would be the use of imprisonment, physical violence, or captivity to force people to work. But the truth is, forced labor encompasses a lot more concepts than that. Modern slavery is another term that's used, but it's a much broader umbrella that includes different things like using debt or ID confiscation or a range of other things. So if you go to the next slide, debt bondage is an example where employees or workers are put into an endless cycle of debt that they can't escape as they're working in a job, and so they can get trapped in that situation. ID confiscation is when their immigration documents are withheld or threatened. Recruitment fees and wage theft is another tool that's used by people trying to extract forced labor from people. Any deceptive schemes or abuses of vulnerability are also falling under the umbrella of forced labor. And so in the United States, a way that we see that often is people who are in precarious or undocumented immigration status are basically threatened with that status in order to extract forced labor from them. This hit particularly close to home for me as a designer who's focused on this issue and working hard. An example of this that happened right here in the United States is a job I was on. One of the contractors went out of business, went bankrupt, which is not an uncommon thing. But then it came out later that there was a class action lawsuit forming because they were using forced labor amongst their employees. So I share this story because it's often easy to think about this as a faraway problem, as something that's happening in other countries or, different places. But the truth is it happens everywhere. And the other thing that's really crucial to think about with this is building supply chains are global. So this issue is touching every component of a supply chain for material. And it's really important that we as an industry are really working to start shining a light on that and doing our best to reduce the risk of it. If you go to the next slide, the truth is building supply chains are heavily reliant on forced labor. Other industries like the fashion industry, food industry has had a more public reckoning with this, but it applies equally to the building industry. In fact, an estimated 16% of all forced labor abuses occur within the construction industry. To just give you a sense of how big of a problem this is for us as designers, as owners, as builders, it's something that we're all going to be grappling with. If you go to the next slide, this is going to be a very brief presentation. We're about 20 minutes, but I highly recommend that you dig into the Design for Freedom report by Grace Farms. This document really helped kick off our involvement in this movement and is a great overview of the problems that are faced by our industry. If you go to the next slide, they've identified the highest risk industry materials that are used in buildings. And if you're browsing this list and you're a designer or familiar with the industry, you know that this basically means every aspect of a building has a supply chain that's at risk. So the question for us as designers, once we learned about this and once we, it's such an easy thing to feel strongly morally about, what do we actually start doing? If you go to the next slide, and actually you can advance one more. The first thing that we thought we could do as designers was start to do research and look at global regional risk information for forced labor. And we were going to try to avoid high-risk supply chains and different things like that. But the reality is it's an extremely complex situation. And the difficulty of using regions only as a tool is, one, I've already mentioned, supply chains are global. So even if you identify where a product is manufactured, the upstream supply chain could still come from high-risk regions. Another thing we started to realize is there are good actors in bad contexts and bad actors in good contexts. And when we started trying to use this as a tool, it was potentially the risk of alienating people who are trying to do the right thing when their competitors are not. And lastly, it's a really dynamic issue. I mean, a company that may not be documented as using forced labor could suddenly get caught using it, or vice versa. A company could go through the efforts to clean up their supply chain and to eliminate bad actors, and then we would not be up to speed with that. So if you go to the next slide, the next tool that we started looking into was certifications. And certifications are something that we're all probably familiar with, especially when it comes to sustainability and product health. But we wanted to dig in and understand what materials have certifications for labor, ethical sourcing, and those issues. What we found is some familiar certifications like Cradle to Cradle on the left that we already used for sustainability certifications actually included pretty robust social equity requirements, and we were really encouraged to learn about that. We also came across new certifications that we weren't familiar with, like Responsible Steel, which is a certification for the steel industry specific to labor as well as sustainability. So if you go to the next slide, we started building a huge spreadsheet of every certification we could find, and then materials that were in that list or in those certifications. And we realized that very quickly that this could be a really valuable resource, that if we had come across it earlier, it would have helped jumpstart our approach to this issue. And so what we did is we wrote a white paper summarizing these results. So if you go to the next slide, the white paper is available for download. It's really meant to serve as a primer for the certifications that are out on the market, what we came across. And then if you go to the next slide, the bulk of the paper is focused on a spreadsheet that we've made of all the certifications that we found at the time, as well as an analysis of what they do and how they certify the different companies. So if you go to the next slide, what we found that was the most meaningful distinction between these certifications actually ended up becoming how they certify the products. Because essentially, if a certification is focused on forced labor, they're almost always going to include child labor. They're almost always going to include workers' rights. It's kind of like a package deal. And so the way they certified the products became a much more distinguishing factor. We identified three broad categories that supplier certifications use. One is self-reported information. So this is the company that's being examined submits their company policy or their employee records or any other documentation that's required to analyze their company. Observation or auditing is when a third party observes the work of the company that's trying to get certified, either remotely, in person, announced, unannounced, or through an approved third party. And the last method that we saw these certifications using was legal and social context. So this is broader analysis of regional risk, of industry risk, and that often fed into what level of investigation was needed. And the truth is, all certifications tended to use all three of these. I'm going to dig into cradle to cradle for a minute. If you go to the next slide to give you an example from a familiar submittal of what these different tiers would mean. So as the basis of getting a cradle to cradle certification, the company must have a commitment to specifically the elimination of all forced or compulsory labor and child labor. So to us, this represents a self-reported level of information. You know, the company is committing to doing something, but it's not necessarily vetted or certified by a third party. If you go to the next slide, once you reach the bronze level of a cradle to cradle, you need to identify the risk of your final stage of manufacturing as well as your tier one or the next direct supplier for that manufacturing stage. This is really a commitment to transparency. There's no necessary actions taken other than progress to assessing risk beyond. It may not sound like a lot, but we think this is really important to start introducing transparency into supply chains is such a crucial first step. If you go to the next slide, once you get to gold, human rights risks are assessed for the complete supply chain, and then high risk areas that are identified require third-party auditing. So this would be one of the more robust levels that we identified where a third-party auditor is actually directly observing crucial parts of a supply chain for a product. So if you go to the next slide, that was one example. We went through that process for every certification we could find that was related to the built environment, and we put it in this table. So we encourage you to take advantage of that effort that we made and learn about what was available on the market when we published it 2 years ago, with the asterisk that this is a constantly evolving field. More and more people are getting on board. So we also encourage you to be on the lookout for new certifications. Okay, next slide. I'm going to go into the tools that we have available today for the second half of this presentation. So generally speaking, what we have found to be really useful at this stage and where things are with certifications are these databases that allow us to filter products based on their certifications. So prerequisite for using this effort or using this strategy would be to have an understanding of what certifications are dealing with forced labor. Then you can go to these platforms, you can filter to only browse products that have those certifications. That said, mindful materials, I'm going to go into an example there. If you go to the next slide, they actually allow you to filter by the common framework, which is really helpful if you're not as familiar with all of the subsequent certifications. So if you click on the product portal on their main website, you'll get to the next slide where you can basically filter for social health and equity as a common framework. From there, I've done an example here of filtering for floor tiles, but you can get more and more specific about what you want to filter, and then basically create a curated list of products that have a certain degree of certification to start browsing from as you're speccing a project. And if you go to the next slide, what we like about these tools, these platform-based tools, it's not only specific to mindful materials, is you also get to see often the other certifications that they have. Because we as designers aren't operating on a single issue, we also are really passionate about sustainability and product health. So that said, once you go into this specific product, you can actually see what their score was on specifically the social fairness component of the Cradle to Cradle certification, which is what we were looking into in more detail earlier. So that's one example of how to use a platform. If you go to the next slide, these databases are constantly changing. There's new ones coming up, and they're adding new features. So we encourage you to also be on the lookout for other databases. The Parsons Healthy Materials Lab collects this with a focus on healthy materials, but a lot of those databases also allow you to filter for social equity metrics. Design for Freedom, again, after you read the report, I highly encourage you to dig into their toolkit where they have lists of certifications that are related to this cause, as well as example spec language, and many other great resources for design teams. And then I also have the logo for Health Product Declaration Collaborative with Wendy and Mark. We're actually helping introduce social equity to the HPD builder and transparency label. So Wendy may speak more on that, but the point is there are new forms of being able to look for this information becoming available regularly as well. So we really encourage everyone to stay diligent. If you go to the next slide, a slightly more specific way that you can search for materials is if you know the specific certification that you're looking for, those websites often have databases as well. So when we're looking for example, a office furnishing, the BIFMA level is a certification for office furnishing specifically. So you could go browse their list of approved certified products and start there when you're doing your sourcing. So that's the kind of tools that we use initially as designers when we're starting to look for what tile, what floor, what carpet we want to use on a project. But it's useful for owners as well. It's useful for people who are building their own project. It's useful for construction teams as well who are looking for alternates or competitors. And if you go to the next slide, this is looking at tools that are a little bit more broad and about goal setting. So this is a really important part of this process, is establishing with project teams at an early stage what the goals are going to be in order to reach or reduce the risk of forced labor in your project. So the Living Building Challenge is a great certification, extremely robust. Specifically, they have an equity pedal where they have very robust requirements for social equity certification requirements. LEED also has a pilot credit for social equity and ethical supplying. So you can early on in a project, agree with the project team that that's a value that you're going to go for, a points that you're going to go for, and that helps set a common target for the team to work on throughout the phases of a project. And lastly, SEAM is a relatively new certification that is essentially hoping to be the lead for social equity issues related to real estate development. So we're really excited to dig into that and see what they're doing. But again, all of these are really important tools to get the project team on the same page early on. If you go to the next slide, we're really interested in how to create market change around this issue. So next slide, what we mean by market change is an example we like to use is low VOC paint. It used to be a very niche product that only a few people knew about or requested. Through the efforts of people who are focused on product health and interior air quality, it has now become the norm. Every major paint manufacturer provides a low or no VOC product, and an average consumer knows what it means and asks for it in a project. We want that same transformation to happen with equitable labor and equitable sourcing. So if you go to the next slide, the sort of conclusion that we're going to make today, or what I'm going to leave you with, is steps that we see the industry taking to make progress in this. So one, using the process I described earlier, or whatever other process, sharing material libraries, we need to start incorporating certified products into our material libraries so that we as designers can share those with owners, share those with builders, and really start getting these to be on the forefront of what we use in projects. We can include requirements and specifications. Again, this is really important. Those early conversations as a team to make sure everyone's aware of what the issue is, the steps that can be taken, and to set those common goals early on. We think it's really important to forge new connections in your local building market. So if there is not a responsible steel certified provider in your local market, have a conversation with the steel provider that you do work with and see if it's something they're interested in. Let them know that you're interested in it as from your side so that they know there's a demand for it. And lastly, we can avoid high risk materials and products with when you don't have a certification or any other tool, you can do your own research and try to avoid those high risk materials. If you go to the next slide, bigger long-term change, we really think it's important to advocate for policies and building codes that require supply chain transparency. This is starting to happen in other countries. In Europe and the UK, they have the Modern Slavery Act. We strongly support this, and we think everyone who's interested in this issue should as well, because that's going to also really help generate market change. We really think it's important to build and share material libraries and things that you find. We really don't want to develop a commercial edge because we are more equitable or using less social or less forced labor. We think the goal should be for everyone to be sharing as much as possible to eliminate this issue. And we need to support research and reporting on this issue in our industry to shine a light on it so that awareness grows and that innovation happens in our industry to start making our supply chains more transparent. And lastly, last slide of the presentation is how project teams can work together. We really think at this early stage, it's important to reward transparency to help our industry realize that the first few people who are going to start uncovering their supply chains are going to find bad things, but that transparency is such a crucial first step, and we need to support as many people taking that step as we can in order to get to the next step of eliminating it. Secondly, if you're on this call, you're one step in the right direction here is to become familiar with forced labor certifications and the long-term goals of the movement, and have conversations. Owners can have conversations with designers, designers with builders, designers can inform a project team of this issue. Whatever position you're coming from, start talking about this issue, start talking about what you can do. And lastly, we really are encouraging everyone to be inclusive. It's a subtle distinction, but what we like to say is we're not trying to spec a building with no forced labor products in it. We're trying to eliminate forced labor in the building industry. And the way you do that is you fold as many people into that effort as possible. Fold as many product manufacturers into that, get as many people talking about it and asking about it as we can. And lastly, not being afraid to take small steps toward that goal, doing whatever we can to start making progress. Okay, that was a lot to cover in 20 minutes. Happy to answer questions at the end. Thank you, everyone, and I'll hand the mic back to you, Mark.
Well, thank you, Russell, for bringing such an important topic to our audience. You know, since this might be new information for some people, you know, just the scope of this problem in the industry, you know, I highly recommend and encourage our audience to check out those resources from Design for Freedom, their report and toolkit, and the COOKFOX white paper. They're both excellent resources for getting some more information about this topic and knowing what to do about it. So thank you. Our next speaker is Wendy Vittori. Wendy is the Executive Director for the Health Product Declaration Collaborative, a not-for-profit member organization committed to transparency and innovation for safer and healthier building products. Prior to assuming this position in 2015, Wendy has served as a leader in business, academic, and civic contributions for over 30 years. Beginning her career as a software engineer, she led technology businesses at both Intel Corporation and Motorola. In 2007, Wendy founded Vittori Consulting LLC, a strategy and organization consulting firm. She has served as a faculty associate at the ASU Nonprofit Management Institute and was assistant professor at Northeastern University College of Business in Boston, Massachusetts. She received an AB from Harvard College, an MBA from Northeastern University, and was a doctoral candidate and Arthur D. Little Fellow at the Harvard Business School in the fields of strategic management and entrepreneurship. In 2017, Wendy was a recipient of the Women in Sustainability Leadership Award. So I'm very happy that Wendy was able to join us. And Wendy, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you to Austin Energy Green Building for hosting this really important session today. I want to just acknowledge what Russell said and the work that his organization has done. Many of you may already be familiar with our work at HPD Collaborative. I'm going to start off just by giving you a brief overview for those who are not as familiar with it. But I can tell you that among the many different architecture and design firms that we work with in these efforts, the work that Russell and his team at COOKFOX have done really stands out. So I'll just second Mark's suggestion to check out those resources and that white paper. There's a lot of great information there. So if we can go to the next slide, please. What I'm going to do today is just give you a brief overview of the Health Product Declaration Open Standard and what we do at HPDC. And then I'm going to home in on the work that we are doing right now to advance social equity reporting. So if we can go to the next slide. The HPD Collaborative and the HPD Open Standard were started a little over a decade ago because a growing number of, in particular, architects and designers started to ask the question, how do the building products that we are selecting, specifying, affect human and environmental health? And there were some observations that everybody started to talk about, 80,000 chemicals. There are at least that many that are in commerce today. And we all became aware that, gosh, everything we select is composed of chemicals. So how can we start to get our hands around this? And so at the time, the types of tools that were available really were very difficult to access and generally did not provide the information that you needed to inform decision making that people wanted to do. So the next slide, we developed the HPD Open Standard specifically to address those issues of information availability, having a standard format that would be easy to understand, specifying what the actual information that is needed is in order to answer that question, how do the chemicals and products affect human and environmental health? And we coined the term material health to actually incorporate both human and environmental health aspects because they're highly interrelated. For example, if a substance like PFAS gets into the water table through environmental pollution, then humans drink that and then those impacts happen. So, all of the types of things that get the chemicals into the air, into the water, into dust, and so on are all interrelated and can affect both the health of the environment itself, meaning the natural environment of the plants, the animals, and so on, as well as the humans that inhabit this here. And so we wanted it to have certain attributes, that have become easy to use, fast to use, be accessible to anyone. And we also had in mind from the beginning that if we were able to put this in place, when we did that, we wanted to make the benefits of this work available beyond the building industry so that we could grow that impact, because obviously chemicals are in products in every industry, not just the building industry. So if we go to the next slide, based on those goals, we developed what we call the Health Product Declaration Open Standard. And you see here a depiction. It has a standardized format. It has become widely accepted now in the building industry to report this type of information. So it's very comprehensive about the chemical ingredients of products and various ways of understanding how those interact with human and environmental health. So if we go to the next slide. As part of this effort, there was really an understanding that this reporting step and understanding what is in the products themselves was just the first step. And as Russell well said, transparency, which is manufacturers reporting that information and sharing that information, is the first step that enables all the next steps to happen. And so at the time when all of this was occurring about 10 years ago, groups of us got together. We formed a harmonization task group that composed of the leading certifications, Cradle to Cradle, Declare at that time, LEAD, and so on, all working together to sort of formulate, well, what would be those steps? And so as we need information all the way along this pathway, going from just basically what's in it, then how do we understand? How do we screen? What are substances of concern? How do we know which of these chemicals we should pay more attention to? Are any of them safer, for example? So screening. And then we have to look at all of the different chemicals that compose a product and assess those. What then is going to be the impact on human and environmental health of having all these chemicals inside a product? That's assessment. And then we need to go to the next step and say, well, how do we start to have products that reduce and hopefully even eliminate the use of the chemicals that are of concern? And if I'm an architect and designer, how do I find products that are safer and healthier? We call that optimization. And then the rating steps is various different certifications and ratings. And, Russell did a good job touching on some of those that are out there that do all this work and then deliver an end rating. And that may be something that an architecture or design project can then just use. But underlying all of that is a lot of detailed work, is a lot of detailed evaluation steps. And our goal with the HPD Open Standard was to open up, peel back the lid on how this all happens, develop an industry-wide standard for how this can occur so that we can dramatically accelerate the number of products and the number of projects where this can happen. So if we go to the next slide, we conceived of this ecosystem where we had to have really everybody working together. And so the HPD collaborative organization was formed in order to bring together people from all aspects of the building industry who need to participate if something like this is to be successful. So the product libraries and data management tools, the certification systems, all of the screening assessment methods that underlie being able to do all those steps. Obviously, the building and design and construction project teams, and very importantly, the product manufacturers. This information all originates with manufacturers. And so it's really important that those manufacturers feel that this is an environment that's going to be helpful to their aspirations to make their own products healthier and safer. So if we go to the next slide. We also wanted to make it easy and efficient over time. And this is something that is a work in progress that we work on every day. But basically, this involves using information technology in order to connect all this data, all these different players, and eliminate as much as possible the tedium of using spreadsheets and sending emails and sending RFIs and so on, and replace that with a high quality, rigorous, automated ability to exchange data and really grow that knowledge at a much more rapid rate as a consequence of redirecting the time and effort into more value-added aspects of this work. And so that has been a really key underlying principle as well. If we can go to the next slide, please. And so what you see here is the growth that we have experienced with this effort, since going back to sort of the initial concepts of doing this, and can we make this work in the building industry? And all of you are working in the building industry, or most of you who are on this call. And so you know from your own experience that coordinating the many, many different players in the building industry is a challenging task sometimes. And so we saw that an open standard, meaning a standard in which everyone can participate, there are no barriers to entry, and using it would be the best route that we could think of to pulling this effort together and actually making this happen. And so, you know, we have a long way to go still to make this available for every project and every product. That is our aspiration. And we're going to do that by growing the acceptance of it, making it easier and easier, taking less time, and producing a more and more robust result as we go along. And so you can see here just a snapshot of where we are today with over 12,000 HPDs. Each HPD can cover more than one product. And so collectively, they represent over 40,000 building product SKUs, and over 800 manufacturers have produced at least one HPD. Transparency is key to our effort. And so for this reason, when a manufacturer completes their work on an HPD report, they publish that to our HPD public repository, which is a publicly available repository. And so all the information in these reports becomes publicly available through the HPD public repository, as well as with our partners, the product libraries, the workflow tools that we provide the information to through our APIs. And so if we go to the next slide, you can see an example here of this. This is in the Ecomedes product catalog, where over 26,000 building products listed in that catalog have HPDs available for them. If we go to the next slide. So the types of things that this enables is, for example, I mentioned PFAS earlier. This is a topic that many people want to find out more about. If I want to sort of look at what products might have PFAS, and I start researching, and then I want to go find the chemical contents of those products, the HPD public repository is where that type of information can be found. And so here you see an example where there's 396 roofing related products, and roofing being a category that is likely to contain PFAS chemicals. And so these tools have been developed, and we continue to develop them on a daily basis to make pinpointing this type of information easier and easier. So if we go to the next slide. Another thing that we're doing is working on evolving the format of the HPD. So what I showed you earlier is what we started off, and what was requested, in fact, by architects and designers as what would be useful to them would be a PDF in a standard format. So I always know where XYZ information is on that form. And so in today's information age, interactive formats, most of us use a lot of the information. We don't print it out anymore. We use it right on our computers. And so what we've been working on over the last couple of years are interactive formats of that same data. And here you see a depiction of the HPD in an interactive dashboard type of a format, where we are able to introduce, much better representations that are easier to understand, faster to understand, and also enable interactivity. So if I want to know what a particular chemical is, wouldn't it be great if I could click on that and just get that information right there and then, rather than having to stop, go do a Google search or something like that. And so this is a direction that we're going. And in fact, we are just in the final phases of bringing these new tools into production, which will be next month. So if we go to the next slide. What I want to do now is tell you a little bit about the work we've been doing over the last 3 years. So as social equity has become more and more of a focus of people who are looking at the health and safety of products. What we found as we started to develop more and more information and so on, and project teams were starting to use it, manufacturers starting to use it, questions about social equity impacts started to come up more and more. So if you go to the next slide, the goal of the HPD since its inception has actually implicitly included social equity concerns. When we look at the hazard profile of a chemical, what that talks about is the potential human and environmental health impacts throughout the entire life cycle of that chemical. That goes back to if it's something that's extracted from the earth or something, a chemical manufactured in a factory, what impacts might be going on there in workers or fence line communities and so on, all the way through to the end of life when something is disposed of, or during the production phase, there might be emissions related to particular chemicals. When they're combined, various effects can happen. And so the way that we report on that information in HPDs implicitly does include this type of information. If there have been reports that relate to workers in fence line communities and emissions and so on, that data will show up in the hazard profile of a chemical. But it's implicit. What this is all about is how do we make that information more explicit? So how, if I'm Russell embarking on what his firm just did over the last several years, how do we make that sort of information much more readily available? And you heard him talk about what was involved to try and start to figure this out. So just as we have done in other areas of transparency, how can we use that same approach, bring that into the areas of social equity? There's a tremendous amount of overlap between the chemicals and social equity issues that happen. So we wanted to really start to use the tool set that we developed, the methodologies we developed, to bring that information from the background into the foreground. And how do we make that information directly available to decision makers? So as they're looking at the health and safety aspects of the product, this goes hand in hand with that information. We also find that manufacturers themselves are becoming increasingly interested in understanding the intersection of the supply chains that they have, chemicals in them, and social equity issues. So this was the context in our work on social equity at HPDC. So if we go to the next slide, we formed what we call a social equity technical subgroup in 2021, explicitly to investigate and evaluate and look at those questions and what could we do to start to identify specific pieces of information that illuminate that intersection between material health and social equity. And so what that means is that we're looking for specific data elements that we can harmonize the reporting of across the industry. We're looking at what programs are necessary to help manufacturers and project teams understand this information. That's a key element that we found is so important in our work. So you can put a piece of data out there, but if people don't understand its meaning and significance or where to find it, you're not going to get very far. So we look at programs to support that. And then how do we really collaborate with all the other programs and groups working in this area already? And I think Russell did a good job giving you some insight into the depth and breadth of what is going on out there. It's significant. And so what our role can be is to understand across those what are common pieces of information and work to harmonize their reporting so that there's a standard methodology, there's a standard understanding, and then everyone can use that. And then we have more accuracy, consistency, and reliability of information across that whole supply chain, from product to product, from manufacturer to manufacturer, from project team to project team. And that's really the goal here. We go to the next slide. And so these are some of the things that we have been working on in this social equity technical subgroup. And that group is composed of members of HPDC. HPDC, as I mentioned on the earlier slide, we have over 400 member companies. Many of them are manufacturers of products, also architecture and design teams, rating and certification programs, consultants, researchers that work in the area of material health. And so we have a great representation of all of those dimensions of the building industry on all of our technical subgroups. We have 4 different technical subgroups. This is one of them at HPDC. So the first thing we recognized as we looked at all of what was going on was that location is key. It's sort of in real estate, you hear location, location, location. Nothing could be more true of social equity than that, because so many of the issues revolve around locations. I think Russell did an excellent job of really talking about understanding the location where something is happening is really a first step. It doesn't mean that a particular product or a particular manufacturer is or is not doing that. And it doesn't mean that if there's a location where there's not a prevalence of social equity issues, nothing is happening. But it can be a very helpful step, in particular for manufacturers, because supply chains are global and a lot of them are pretty opaque. It's hard to know what's happening in the lower tiers of your supply chain. There's a lot of commodity procurement of things like chemicals, for example. If I'm making a chair, I may not myself know the manufacturer of the chemicals that the chair is composed of. And so what I could know, however, I could be informed about places where those chemicals are made, and that might enable me to start asking questions of my supply chain about what might be happening with suppliers down further in the chain. And that's really so critical to the location data, is really starting to enable people to be informed about what might be occurring. And so we did add the location data element to HPDs last year. What this enables is manufacturers to report the location of any ingredient that's used in their product at any point in the production of the product, including the end manufacturer, including where a chemical might be extracted. Project teams can ask manufacturers to go and update their HPDs to include this information. It's very easy to do. They just simply go in, they edit the HPD, they can add that, whatever they have. It's unlikely that they're going to have comprehensive location data. They can add whatever information they do have at that point. We have, like Russell, also been working, and his inputs were very valuable in developing this comprehensive list of social equity ratings and certifications. And so what we are doing is we're adding into the HPD open standard in our HPD builder a drop-down menu that will prompt manufacturers to look at what certifications and ratings are available for social equity, explain what they are, explain different elements about them, and then as they start to have them, report that they have those certifications. And so this is very much about enabling manufacturers who are working in this area and doing work to show this as part of their HPD report. We have been working very closely with Grace Farms, Design for Freedom, and in particular, there is a supplier questionnaire that is part of the toolkit that they provide. And we have automated that so that it can be filled online with an automated tool. We launched this last month, and we are making it available in the HPD builder. So again, the goal here is to enable manufacturers easily to find it, easily to complete it, and to be able to include that with their HPD report so that a project team that wants that can send the message to the manufacturer, go there, please update, please complete that, and then that information becomes easily available through the HPD public repository and other methods. And then after looking at this for the last couple of years, we've decided that really what would be helpful would be to develop some best practice guidance. And this is very much along the lines of what Russell spoke about earlier. As he mentioned, he is a member of our technical subgroup and has had so many contributions. But What we want to do is take all of this know-how that is starting to emerge, create a best practice guidance that manufacturers can start to follow. So this is what is possible. This is what project teams are looking for. And so if I'm a manufacturer and I want to start to do work in this area, and we want to encourage that, I have a place to go to get a comprehensive reference and tools to help me with this reporting. So that's all work underway right now. We go to the next slide. So, in summary, we think that by adding social equity reporting into HPDs, we can help greatly with growing awareness. We can assist both manufacturers and project teams to get access to high quality data. And very importantly, we can continue to work on making all of these practices more efficient, more effective, so that they can be more widely utilized within all of this work. So if we go to the next slide. It's important to remember that this is just the first step, and I think I'm just echoing here what Russell said. This information is going to be an important stepping stone, but what is really important is that people who work on projects start to use these tools, start to direct, in particular, manufacturers to these resources, to start to ask them for this information. We know from manufacturers that the thing that is most important to them to get started, whether it's material health reporting, social equity reporting, is to have a request from a project team come to them. That's the most important. That is a huge amount of leverage that you have to accelerate this work in our industry. We go to the next slide. Also, it's important to understand circularity relates to this topic. We sometimes think about them as kind of separable things. We have sustainability here, we have circularity here. They're all related. So when these practices are reused, the impact of them is amplified. And what we want to do is really understand that we can stop that at the outset. We can stop that at the first decision. So something cannot create further impacts that are adverse, unwanted, if it's never done in the first place. And so that's a lot of what our transparency and reporting activity is about with HPDC, is to enable those decision makers at the project team level, at the manufacturing level, to make those better decisions right from the start of their efforts. If we go to the next slide. As I mentioned earlier, we are very focused on ensuring that the work that we do, while it has high impact in the building industry, we do it in a way that enables its reuse in other industry segments. And that will be true also of the social equity work that we've talked about here. And so your support for this helps us also grow those connections. We're already working in the cleaning products area, which is adjacent. A lot of the work that has been done with HPDs has been in textiles and fabrics, which obviously has reuse in the apparel industry. And so it's important to know that your effort to support this work has impact even beyond our building industry. And so just in summary, if we go to the next slide, I want to thank you again for giving us this opportunity to share this information. If anyone is interested in more information, just get in touch with me. We want to hear about your great work in this area. And if you are interested in participating in the social equity technical subgroup, there's an open call for applicants to participate that is coming out this week or next week from HPDC. So keep your eye open for that. So with that, Mark, I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Wendy. I feel like I'm still new in the sustainability field. So I remember a time when the only information we were getting was like Russell was showing, like those paint VOC content. So just like the amount of information that's available now and like, the databases that we have available just really speaks to the work that your group has done in, working with manufacturers and getting that information available out to architects and engineers. So thank you so much for that work and for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
Well, we'll move to our last speaker today is Mike Johnson. Mike Johnson is Director of Materials at the International Living Future Institute. He is a net positive visionary and sustainability professional whose decades-long career path has led him from environmental restoration fieldwork and social entrepreneurship to corporate executive leadership. In various roles as founder and CEO, Director of Sustainability, and as Chief Sustainability Officer, he brings real-world context and practical solutions to individuals and organizations seeking to have net positive impact. Mike's understanding of how commerce is a powerful force in the balance of planet, people, and economy has enabled his sustainability initiatives to grow from startup level to industry recognized and leading edge in various organizations. He is a founding member of the Living Product 50, whose members seek to bring independently verified net positive products to market. Thank you for being with us, Mike, and I'll let you take it from here.
Hey, great. Thanks so much, Mark. And it's always a pleasure to work alongside Wendy. We've been doing it for about a decade now. And Russell, really great to present with you as well. One hazard of following such talent is that oftentimes we're going to repeat a little bit of what each other have said, but I'm going to take that as an opportunity and hope to really reinforce some of the same messages that have already been said and to kind of reinforce with a different point of view. So first of all, International Living Future Institute, quite the mouthful from here on out. I'm going to say ILFI to save time and effort. But we are an independent nonprofit organization that is looking to make real change in the building industry by asking one simple question. And that is simply, what does good look like? It's no longer enough, we know, to limit the damage that we've been doing to the planet or to social equity or to human health. We have to start thinking about what's good and how do we get there. Next slide, please. So what I'd like to do today is actually start with a question. Actually, that's not the next slide. If we could back up to the first slide, that'd be great. Right, let's see if we get to the next one here. Next slide, please. Okay, we have the wrong slide deck here, apparently. So I'm just going to go ahead and go with this anyways, and perhaps the order got rearranged. But I want to ask everybody in the audience a simple question to start with, just for context, and that is, I can't see you, which is one of the things I don't like about virtual presentations, but if you ate lunch or breakfast this morning, please raise your hand. And I'm assuming that all of you out there have raised your hand, or at least most of you. And the next follow-up question for you is, did any of you actually stop to think that you might be poisoning yourself by simply eating breakfast or lunch? Hopefully none of you had that thought, because that would be a terrible thought, terrible way to start the day. But the reason I ask that is we have to think about the context of what we're doing on a daily basis. And we don't have to think about that when it comes to food, because in North America, we have food safety laws. And those food safety laws prevent toxins from going into our food knowingly. They also mandate that all ingredients that go into your foods are published on the label. So you know as a consumer exactly what you get to eat, exactly what you want to eat, and you can make choices for yourself. Well, why shouldn't it be that way in the building industry? Why should we have to worry about the spaces that we're surrounded by every day and the thousands upon thousands of individual compounds and chemicals that surround us, especially given that we spend about 90% of our time as North Americans indoors? That means we have hundreds, if not thousands, of chemicals all around us at all times, and all sorts of methods of being exposed to those, whether it's thermal contact, whether it's ingestion, inhalation. Worse yet, as Wendy mentioned earlier, we have about 80,000 chemicals at any one time in commerce right now. So with very little toxicological data on the vast majority of those chemicals and hundreds, if not thousands of those surrounding our indoor environments every single day, then we have really no idea how much risk we are at because of the simple lack of transparency and the ability to choose as we do with our food. So I really want to underscore the importance of this. Next question I'd like to ask you is, can you imagine in your practice, if you're an architect, a designer, or a contractor, or whether you're a parent or a friend, or even for yourself, can you imagine willingly and knowingly putting asbestos or lead-based paint into your project today? Hopefully you'd find that laughable, and I think you probably would. The same should be true with the vast majority of chemicals that are out there today that we know very little about that can have real and lasting long-term effects. Wendy and Russell both mentioned the PFAS group of chemicals right now that are raising so much concern. And with that, we have to think about our liability and our professional responsibility of what is going into our built environments as professionals, as individuals. It's not just upon the manufacturing community. It's not just upon the folks that are installing it. It's upon all of us to think very holistically about the entire value chain of what's being created, how it's being created, and where it's being used. Because we also know that when we're talking about forced labor or social inequities or fence line communities, that the impacts that we're having may not just be direct upon the manufacturer or the consumer, but also upon adjacent communities and adjacent ecosystems. So we really need to know what's out there and what's happening when we choose a product and accept the ramifications of that. So the slide we're on now is showing the declare label, and it says it's a nutrition label for products. I'm going to start here, and I'm going to kind of jump around because the slides are not in order that I anticipated, so bear with me if it's a little bit off. But first and foremost, we need to understand what goes into these labels. There are, we actually have a completely wrong slide deck. Can we go ahead and forward to the next slide, and I'll see what we have here that I could use? Okay, well, we're just going to go with this, reading the label. Up very top, we have the product name and the manufacturing location. We also have a lot of important information. Most importantly, we have all of the ingredients that are intentionally added and all known residuals that go into a product. That's 100% of all product ingredients, just like you would expect on your food. Now that's really important because we have to go down to a threshold that also makes a difference. It wouldn't matter much if I only told you 50% of the ingredients that go into your food. You need to know 100% to feel comfortable to eat it. Likewise, with Declare, 100% of the intentionally added ingredients is disclosed publicly and screened against what's known as the red list. We're going to go into the red list in a moment with a little bit more detail, but that's important for you to be able to make educated choices. And the other thing that can't be forgotten is when a manufacturer actually discovers what's going into the whole supply chain, they can also make better choices. That's why the calls for transparency are so incredibly important. It's not just to make you aware as the purchaser of what you're purchasing, but it's also to encourage manufacturers to know and understand and seek better green chemistry to replace those things that might pose health hazards to the human health or the environment. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, here we go. This one I can work with. The red list here is a list that ILFI produces. It's called the Living Building Challenge Red List of Concern. And it is a long list of chemicals and compounds by CAS number. So you can easily find them, you can easily research them, that are known to be worst in class chemicals that go into the building products industry very commonly. So PFAS, for example, is among that list. Lead, cadmium, heavy metals, a lot of the phthalates, a lot of the things that you already know about or may not know about are on that list to help screen very quickly, very efficiently, to know whether it's one of the worst offending chemicals or not. These might be bioaccumulative, they may be persistent, biotoxins, mutagens, carcinogens. They may have direct impact on the human health and the environment. They might be asthmagens. The list is very long of the possible hazards. But that's why we compiled the red list, to make this relatively simple, to screen out the worst known compounds that are commonly in building products today. And that's also really important because, as we have said, we want to have a very holistic picture on what we're purchasing. It shouldn't just be about the health of the occupant of the building or the health of the final manufacturing location. It needs to be about the health of humans and all species along the entire value chain, from extraction all the way, hopefully, to a circular economy or ultimately possibly disposal. We want to take into account the adjacent communities and all ecosystems and impacts. One thing that's important to note is if we have a label that is called red list free, That means the manufacturer has assured you, the consumer, that of all the intentionally added ingredients and all the intentionally known residuals, there is no red list ingredient included there. And that's down to 100 parts per million, which is 0.01% of the product by final weight. So it's a relatively good screening, something that you can rely upon pretty heavily. And red list is therefore our best recommendation if you can find a red list declared label for a product. Okay, next slide, please. We can go ahead and pass this one. Okay, a little bit more about what's on the declare label. If you look where on the left and the right in the example declare label, you can see that some of the ingredients are in kind of that bright orange red, and some are in like a yellow orange. If it's in a bright orange red, that means it's actually on the red list, and it's something that we want to eliminate from production or use as quickly as possible, because those do have those impacts that I was speaking about. And hopefully, we can get rid of those ingredients, those worst in case, as quickly as possible by eliminating those from our choices. Sometimes those do have what's called an essential use, and that is a very temporary exception that we have when we want to make sure that manufacturers aren't substituting a regrettable substitution just to get rid of a red list, which may have worse impacts further down the line. So we want to be very careful about how we eliminate. We want manufacturers to be in the know of why, so that when they go for greener chemistry, they know what they're trying to solve for, and we're actually solving for problems and not creating new ones. Next is that orange, light yellow, and that means it's on our priority watch list. The red list has two levels of watching. One is just called the watch list. It's something that we're researching for future possible inclusion, and we're trying to get industry consensus from those professionals that can give us information about the toxicological or environmental impacts that may be associated before we graduate it to the priority list. Priority list is essentially a 1-year heads up, give or take, to manufacturers saying, this is going to make it to the red list almost certainly. It's time for your R&D department to find something better, something that's healthier for humans and the environment. Okay, next slide, please. And once again, declaration statuses are really important to pay attention to. There are 3. The first one is, again, red list free. That means that all of the product ingredients, 100% down to that 0.01% threshold, are publicly disclosed. That's number 1, super important, as Wendy was discussing. Number 2, they've also been screened 100% of those against the red list, and none of those red list materials are contained in that product. Next, please. Okay, next slide, there we go. This one is red list approved. Now, red list approved also means that 99 to 100% of the product's ingredients have been disclosed. Now, there's a 1% difference in there. That 1% is for a temporary exception for manufacturers to be able to withhold proprietary information on an ingredient. However, 100% of the ingredients still must be screened against the red list to make sure that manufacturers and consumers both know whether that product contains a red list ingredient or not. The red list approved status can also have a temporary exception related to things like small electronic component boxes or LED strips, for example, where it may not be possible yet to report 100% of all intentionally added ingredients. Those are temporary exceptions that will evolve and be pushed away, but the red list approved is the next best type of label to choose if you're looking for full transparency and assurance that there's no red list ingredients included. And then finally, next slide, please. We have the declared status. Declared simply means that 100% again of the product's ingredients have been publicly disclosed on the label. However, there are at least 1, and if not more, red list ingredients included. Now that might give you a little bit of pause, but I want to assure you that a declared label still is a massive step in the right direction for a manufacturer that ought to be applauded, because the vast majority of manufacturers are not disclosing their product ingredients to 100% levels and down to that 0.01% threshold. So the mere fact that a manufacturer has any level of a declare label means they should be applauded and rewarded for doing so, because it almost certainly means that they're on the journey with us to make sure all products can be healthy for the environment and humans. Okay, move on, please. So one thing that I heard resonate multiple times when Wendy and Russell were speaking is something that I talk about all the time and I'm very passionate about, and that is the concept of interconnectedness. Now, the concept of interconnectedness, I think, was best paraphrased by what one of my favorite authors, John Muir, said. He said something essentially that when you tug on one thing in the universe, you find it connected to everything else. And I envision that, I think, as an easy visual. If you find a sweater with a loose thread and you tug on it, we all know what's going to happen. Eventually, that entire sweater is going to unravel and you're just going to have a mess of yarn. Well, that's sort of what we're doing when we're focusing on single attribute issues, impacts, problems, or benefits. We want to start to think very holistically about social equity, about forced labor, about human health, about adjacent fence line community impacts. We want to think about the future and restoration of our planet and regenerative products, not just what are we doing for the health of the occupant of the building, or is this emitting VOCs? We want to look very holistically. And that's where the Living Product Challenge comes into play. We also heard a lot of talk already about certifications, and this is another certification. However, it is one of the very few certifications in the world that is scientifically rigorous and backed by LCA's, EPD's, social equity, and then full assessment of material health. Okay, next slide, please. And we, again, ask a simple question: to imagine products that actually leave the world in better condition than had they not been made or placed into your space. If we start to imagine the world like that, in other words, if we start to imagine every product and every decision that we make, either professionally or personally, every dollar that we spend, if that goes to actually restoring the planet's ecosystems, to drawing down carbon, for example, to making sure that social equity is included, and now we're actually enhancing human health and ecosystem health. If we start looking at that holistic picture of the 9 planetary boundaries and healing the ones that need healing the most, while not ignoring the others that may be stable or maybe becoming unstable, then we're really going to start to ravel that sweater back together the way it needs to be and it ought to be. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Living Product Challenge, again, is a holistic challenge, and that requires looking minimally at material health. And so for material health, we've been talking about the Health Product Declaration. We've been talking about the Declare label. We first start with that level of transparency, meaningful transparency that enables the manufacturer and the consumer both to understand any possible hazards and move past those. We then require full material assessment to make sure that the toxicological implications are actually known about the specific product and not just assumed as a class of chemicals. We then also look, of course, at the environmental impacts, our environmental footprint, so to speak. We want to make sure that every single one of those impacts, whether it's carbon, whether it's water, whether it's land use or ecosystem impact, we want to make sure every single one of those is measured, quantified, and then reduced whenever possible and wherever possible with a plan for constant improvement. We then go and look at social equity to make sure that, again, forced labor is not a part of the equation, but also that the manufacturer is operating in themselves in a socially equitable manner. So I've been doing this for a long time, and I actually started my career as an entrepreneur, again, with similarities to Wendy. And what I was doing was trying to remove greenwashing from the market by concentrating on identifying companies that had best management practices in the communities that they served in for environmental and social equity. That was a long time ago. So I focused on companies back then. Now, as the director of materials at ILFI, I work on materials and products. But really, we have to have that sweet point that comes together. We don't really benefit as a collective society in purchasing great products from bad companies or purchasing bad products from great companies. We really need the holistic picture again of purchasing great products from great companies that have a great trajectory towards regeneration and an eye on restoration and social equity. So that's where the Living Product Challenge takes all these together, measures them, and moves forward. And by moving forward, I mean, next slide, please. I mean, we start to talk about restoring and regenerating. That's the concept of what's called handprinting. If our footprints are the negative impacts that are left behind, then our handprints are the benefits that we can actually create in our own practice and our own daily lives by being thoughtful, by being diligent, and choosing properly to make sure that we're choosing products and practices that move the needle forward towards restoration and regeneration. Next slide, please. Again, that's the negative impacts versus the positive handprints. So the next slide, please. We'll emphasize one thing that's really important about handprints and footprints measurements and reporting is they have to be measured and reported in the same way so that you know as a consumer that it's apples to apples and that it's not greenwashing. So for base instance, many of you probably understand that product category rules dictate how environmental product declarations are created. They're an equalizing force. We use that same equalizing force when we're measuring the impacts that need to be reduced and then the benefits that need to overcome the remaining impacts. So you can have real confidence that this is a meaningful certification. Move forward, please. And this is a visual for those of you that like kind of the graphical imagery of what I'm talking about in whole. If we look at the center picture, the center circle, we have that cradle to gate footprint that you're all very used to hearing in some way, shape, or form. Social equity is going to be in there. Hopefully, we're going to be looking at extraction. We're going to be looking at end of life disposition, all of the environmental impacts along that way, and quantifying them. But that's all really focused again on mitigating negative impacts or footprints. If we can look beyond that, if we can look at the whole realm of the possibility, then we get into that blue circle on the outer side. And we recognize, we understand that we can successfully overcome those negative impacts that may not be avoidable. And we can go into a realm where positive benefit is quantifiable, replicatable, and perhaps most important, can have a ripple effect. Because when one manufacturer is capable of doing this and showing how it can be done, that can inspire another manufacturer, that can inspire a community of manufacturers to do the same sort of positive hand printing. And that can have tremendously fast and positive impact on the world in its realm of benefit, which is where we need to go. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is an example just to give you a quick shot of what a existing living product challenge label might look like. I'm really excited to tell you that we're about to enter our next iteration of the Living Product Challenge. It will be 3.0, in which we're going to have a lot more ways to bring in more manufacturers, hopefully scale very rapidly across the globe, because this is so incredibly important, getting to regenerative products. And once we do that, we're going to have multiple entryways to really celebrate social equity, environmental equity, and restoration, and of course, human health. Next slide, please. Okay, that might be the last slide because again, I was anticipating another deck. However, I did want to end with some recommendations, which you can't see here, but I'll just tell you, and it's really reinforcing a lot of what you've already heard from Russell and Wendy. The number one recommendation I have for all of you out there, regardless of your profession, regardless of your background, be loud, speak loudly and proudly. Ask every single manufacturer every single time of everything that you buy for documentation of what their sustainability and health and social equity initiatives are. The mere fact that you ask that question will resonate and it will get to the top. The reverse is true. If you don't ask, if you're quiet about your concerns, if you're quiet about what you really want from your products and manufacturers, they have no reason to invest time, money, resources to continue to build these when their competitors may not be doing that. Give them the environmental purchasing prowess that they deserve. Make sure that they understand what you want and what you need. Second, make sure that your firm is loud. If you work for a firm, make sure that it's publicly stated what you're expecting from manufacturers, what you want to see from them, and what you will accept in your libraries. But also, please don't forget that when you're doing this, you have to communicate clearly and early with your clients, because your clients ultimately want ROI, return on investment, right? No client is going to want a ROI that could be negative in a few years when somebody discovers that the next equivalent of asbestos or lead-based paint or VOC emissions is in their built space and they can't lease it, sell it, and they have to clean it up. So we really are looking out for all of our best interests when we're looking out for the holistic picture. And with that, I'm going to end because I know we're really close to time. And again, I thank everybody, especially Austin Energy Greenbuild, for giving me this time. And if you have any other questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to the Living Future Institute, and look forward to working with you all when I can.
Thank you so much, Mike, for that presentation. And the work that you do at the International Living Future Institute and with the Living Building Challenge, with Living Product Challenge, like it's just setting a high bar for projects, and like that aspect of net positive and really doing good and doing some correction out there. So it's important work, and we thank you for being here. And we do apologize for the technical difficulty. We do have the slides that we will include when we follow up with at the end. So we'll get those correct slides out. So with that, we'll kind of transition to our Q&A session. We do have a few minutes left for that. So again, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A box. We'll invite our speakers to turn back on their cameras, and I'll ask Julie if we've gotten any questions coming in.
Yes, we have a couple here. The first one is, which organizations have been the pioneers in incorporating materials with an HBD or declare label? And when do you expect schools and hospitals to make this a standard practice?
Yeah, I'll open it up. I don't know if anybody wants to tackle that one in particular.
I can start. I think the interest in the healthcare industry has been there from the very inception of our work. Some of the people that were involved in helping conceptualize the need for the HPD open standard in the first place, came out of the health architecture world. And so I think that is very important, right? I'll just give a shout out to one of those who happens to be my sister, Gail Vittori, from your own Austin community. And, that pioneering work that she did together with her colleague, Robin Gunther, to talk about the need for material health in healthcare architecture as an example. We haven't really seen other industries step forward. I'll give another nod here to the city of Austin, because we have been working for a number of years to look at ways to incorporate the use of HPDs into the work of various programs within the city. We've also had some really strong participation, in the electronics industry from companies like Google that have been leaders in pioneering this kind of work. I think in particular, there are certain architecture and design firms that have, I think what Mike was saying a moment ago, they've really put it out there in the public what they're doing. And one of those, for example, would be Perkins and Will, that has published their material health protocol, and others such as that. I think those efforts are very, very important.
And I'll just quickly add to that. I think the question is a sage one in terms of wanting to support those that really kicked off the industry. But I also want to remind everybody that there are absolute spearhead leaders that should be recognized. And I'm going to choose somebody outside of the realm, so I don't sound like I'm cherry picking among the many, many manufacturers and clients that have done great work. But if we look at Patagonia, who's outside of the industry realm that I'm speaking of, they're often recognized as the leader all the time, and they're often spoken about, and they should be. However, if we fail to start looking for the other ones that are following in their footsteps, we're going to miss out on rewarding those that are doing that. So I would encourage the questioner to perhaps, if you really want to know where the leaders came from, perhaps that's a better way to look at it. Let's go back to 2015, 16, like Wendy was saying, and let's look at the Perkins and Wills and the Genslers and those that put out the initial call for transparency in a letter and said, you're not going to be in our libraries unless you comply. And let's look back to the Living Product 50 and the Chrysalis of the leaders in manufacturing that were willing to even consider trying for regenerative products, where back then it seemed impossible to meet. And now there are many, many manufacturers and products that meet that standard. Same thing goes for the highest level of cradle to cradle. Look for those regenerative standards that have real meaning, real scientific rigor, and reward them now, please.
Well, thank you for that. We are running a little short on time, so just to kind of be respectful of everybody's time, I'm going to wrap things up. But we will try to get answers for any questions that we received in the Q&A box with our follow-up. So look for that. We also do have one correction from our announcements. The residential manager position with AEGB closes tomorrow, the 20th, not the 30th that was shown on the screen. So if you're interested, please take a look at that and mind that deadline. So again, thank you to our panelists for their great insight and wonderful discussion. And thank you to everyone for attending. Please take a moment to complete the survey link that we did place into the chat. As a reminder, everyone that registered will receive a follow-up email with resource links, including a recording of this webinar. All attendees that joined us for the webinar today will receive a continuing education certificate for self-reporting of GBCI CE hours and AICP CM credits. If you provided your AIA number during registration, we will report your AIA learning unit for attending this webinar. So thank you so much for attending, and we look forward to seeing you again at our next seminar. Bye.